The crystal hall stretched before Ambassador David Sterling like a diplomatic minefield decorated with enough precious gems to fund a small war. 63 Valerian women stood in precise formation, each representing different political factions, trade agreements, or military alliances that could determine humanity's place in galactic politics for generations. The weight of choosing Earth's first formal diplomatic partner pressed against his shoulders like gravity from a neutron star. "Remember, Ambassador," his aide whispered urgently, "Lady Thessa controls the Andorian shipping routes. Commander Vera commands 3 battle fleets. Duchess Mira has connections to the Galactic Trade Council." David nodded absently while scanning the assembled candidates, each more politically advantageous than the last. They stood with practiced poise, displaying accomplishments like merchandise, trade portfolios, military commendations, family crests that could open doors across the galaxy. The selection process felt less like diplomacy and more like shopping for humanity's future. "The choosing ceremony will commence," announced Queen Valeria, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. "Ambassador Sterling will select his diplomatic partner according to Valerian tradition. The chosen one will serve as cultural liaison and represent the formal alliance between our peoples." No pressure whatsoever, David thought, suppressing the urge to request a multiple-choice exam instead. His gaze swept across the candidates again, cataloging political advantages with the efficiency his training demanded. Lady Thessa smiled brilliantly, her family's shipping empire practically gleaming in her confident posture. Commander Vera stood at military attention, her service record more impressive than most human generals. Duchess Mira practically radiated trade agreements and diplomatic connections. Then his eyes found her. Zara stood at the far edge of the formation, apart from the others in a way that seemed both deliberate and inevitable. Where the other candidates wore elaborate gowns designed to showcase their family's wealth, she wore simple ceremonial robes. Where others displayed jewelry signifying their political connections, she wore nothing but a single pendant that looked military in origin. And where every other woman in the hall possessed the flawless beauty that Valerian culture prized above all else, Zara's face and visible arms bore the intricate scars that marked her as untouchable. "Jesus," David breathed, recognizing the ritual scarification patterns from his cultural briefings. Each mark told a story of battle, sacrifice, or loss, permanent reminders of a military campaign that had ended in strategic defeat despite saving thousands of civilian lives. "Ambassador," his aide hissed, "surely you're not considering." "Lady Thessa controls shipping routes," David interrupted quietly. "What does Zara control?" "Nothing, sir. She's politically irrelevant since the Kethra incident. Choosing her would gain us no advantages whatsoever." David watched as other candidates shot glances toward Zara, some pitying, others dismissive, all confirming her status as the option no rational diplomat would consider. She seemed to feel his attention and met his eyes briefly before looking away, her expression suggesting she'd grown accustomed to being overlooked. "The Kethra incident," David said. "Refresh my memory." His aide consulted his tablet reluctantly. "Military engagement 3 years ago. Commander Zara's forces could have secured a strategic victory, but she diverted resources to evacuate civilians instead. The tactical loss resulted in her disgrace and exile from military command. She saved civilian lives. Yes, but at the cost of. She saved civilian lives, David repeated, feeling something shift in his understanding of the woman standing apart from the others. Queen Valeria gestured toward the assembled candidates. "Ambassador Sterling, you may now examine the qualifications of each potential partner. Take whatever time you require to make your selection." The next hour passed in a blur of political presentations. Lady Thessa discussed trade opportunities with the enthusiasm of someone reading stock reports. Commander Vera outlined defensive strategies with clinical precision. Duchess Mira detailed diplomatic connections like items in a catalog. Each conversation felt like interviewing for a business partnership rather than selecting someone he'd worked closely with for years. Professional competence, political advantage, strategic value, everything his training told him to prioritize. When he finally approached Zara, she looked genuinely surprised that he'd bothered. "Ambassador," she said formally, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone expecting dismissal. "I believe you may have been misdirected. I have no political advantages to offer your people. What do you have to offer?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. I understand military strategy. I have experience with complex negotiations under adverse conditions. I know what it means to make difficult choices and live with the consequences." The Kethra incident. Zara's scarred fingers touched her pendant unconsciously. "A military failure that resulted in my current status. Hardly a qualification for diplomatic partnership. You chose to save civilian lives over achieving tactical objectives." "Yes." Her voice carried no regret, only tired acceptance. "And in Valerian culture, that choice marks me as emotionally compromised and strategically unreliable." David studied her face, noting how the scars followed the natural lines of her bone structure rather than disfiguring them. Someone had taken care to ensure the ritual marking enhanced rather than destroyed her features, a consideration that suggested respect even in disgrace. "What if I told you that in human culture, choosing civilian lives over tactical advantage would be considered honorable?" For the first time, Zara's composed expression cracked slightly. "Then I would say your species has interesting priorities, Ambassador." David. "And yes, we do." The morning of David's second day among the Valerians brought a cultural briefing that made him question everything he thought he understood about alien societies. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Earth's leading expert on Valerian customs, projected holographic images of scarification patterns while David's coffee grew cold. "The marks aren't random," she explained, highlighting intricate designs that covered Zara's arms and the left side of her face. Each pattern represents specific military campaigns, strategic decisions, or significant life events. In traditional Valerian culture, they're considered beautiful, proof of experience and wisdom. But not anymore. Not since the cultural purity movement gained influence about 50 years ago. Now physical perfection is prized above experience. Scars are seen as evidence of poor judgment or tactical failure. David studied the images, noting how the patterns seemed to follow natural contours rather than randomly covering skin. Who decides what gets marked? Military tribunals and cultural councils. The scarification is performed by master artists. It's supposed to honor significant events, not punish them. But social attitudes have shifted faster than legal frameworks. So Zara's scars represent achievements, but current society sees them as failures. Exactly. She's caught between two cultural paradigms, honored by old traditions, rejected by new ones. David's personal communicator chimed with a message from the Valerian Protocol Office. Optional cultural exchange activities were available for diplomatic candidates who wished to learn more about their potential partners. Translation: supervised social interaction designed to help him make an informed political decision. He found Zara in the palace's strategy gardens, studying a three-dimensional holographic battle simulation with the focused intensity of someone solving complex equations. The display showed troop movements, supply lines, and tactical decisions from what David recognized as the Kethra campaign. "Reviewing your greatest failure?" he asked, settling beside her on the stone bench. "Analyzing alternative strategies," she replied without looking away from the display. "There were 14 different approaches I could have taken. 13 would have achieved tactical victory, but resulted in civilian casualties. Approximately 8,000 non-combatant deaths across 13 scenarios. The approach I chose saved those lives at the cost of strategic position." David watched her manipulate the hologram, testing different troop deployments with the calm precision of someone who'd run these calculations countless times. "Do you regret your choice?" Regret is irrelevant. The decision was made based on available information and personal ethical framework. Outcome analysis serves learning purposes, not emotional processing. Her clinical tone reminded David of military debriefings, professional distance masking deeper feelings. "That sounds like something you've been told to say." For the first time, Zara's hand stilled on the holographic controls. Valerian military doctrine emphasizes logical analysis over emotional response. Personal feelings compromise strategic thinking. Do you believe that? I believed it until my feelings about civilian casualties overrode tactical objectives. She finally looked at him, and David saw something raw in her expression. Now I'm not certain what I believe about anything. What do you feel about those 8,000 lives you saved? I feel. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. I feel that their continued existence justifies any professional consequences I experienced. Even permanent exile from military command. Even that. David studied her profile as she returned to the tactical display. Her scars caught the artificial sunlight filtering through the garden's crystal dome, creating patterns that somehow enhanced rather than detracted from her features. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure the scarification followed aesthetic principles even while marking her for life. Who designed your scars? He asked. Zara's surprise was evident. Master craftsman Veltar. He was considered the finest scarification artist in the Empire before his death last year. He did beautiful work. Beautiful? The concept seemed foreign to her. They mark me as strategically compromised. Emotionally unreliable. Unsuitable for command or high-level diplomatic partnership. They mark you as someone who chose compassion over convenience. Someone who understood that victory without honor isn't victory at all. Zara stared at him as if he'd spoken in an entirely foreign language. Your cultural perspective is unusual, Ambassador. David. And yeah, humans tend to have weird priorities. We value things like sacrifice, integrity, and the willingness to do what's right even when it's personally costly. These are not considered valuable traits in contemporary Valerian society. Maybe contemporary Valerian society is missing something important. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing one of the scars on her forearm, a pattern that David's briefings had identified as representing exceptional bravery under impossible circumstances. David, she said finally, why are you spending time with me? Lady Thessa could provide your people with exclusive access to trade routes worth billions. Commander Vera's military alliance could protect human colonies for generations. I can offer nothing except complicated political associations and social liability. What if I told you that your company is worth more than trade routes or military alliances? I would say you are either remarkably naive about galactic politics or suffering from atmospheric adaptation syndrome. David laughed, the first genuine humor he'd felt since arriving on the Valerian homeworld. Probably both. But I'd rather have a partner I can respect than one who comes with beneficial shipping contracts. Respect is not typically considered adequate foundation for diplomatic partnership. No, but it's a pretty good foundation for everything else. Zara met his eyes again, and David saw something shift in her expression, confusion mixed with what might have been hope. Everything else? Trust. Friendship. The kind of working relationship where both people actually care about each other's well-being instead of just political advantage. That sounds. She paused, seeming to search for words. That sounds like something I had forgotten was possible. David's heart clenched at the quiet loneliness in her voice. How long since someone chose to spend time with you without political motivations? 3 years, 4 months, 16 days. The precision of her answer revealed exactly how much that isolation had cost her. Since the tribunal's decision regarding Kethra. Jesus, Zara. That's not living, that's just surviving. Survival was the objective. Social interaction was, no longer available. David looked around the strategy gardens, noting how empty they were despite the beautiful setting and advanced holographic displays. Is this where you spend most of your time? It is where I am permitted to spend time without causing discomfort to others. The casual acceptance in her voice made David angry, not at her, but at a society that would waste such obvious intelligence and character because of surgical scars and ethical decisions. Would you like to see the human delegation's quarters? The third day brought a formal dinner that felt more like a political chess match than a social gathering. David sat between Lady Thessa and Commander Vera, both of whom spoke exclusively about the advantages their partnerships would bring to Earth while carefully avoiding any mention of Zara, who had been seated at the far end of the table in what diplomats called the irrelevant zone. The Andorian shipping routes alone would increase human trade capacity by 300%, Lady Thessa explained, her voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. My family's connections extend through 7 star systems. Impressive, David replied, watching Zara pick at her food while pretending not to notice the pointed way other guests avoided conversation with her. And my fleet command includes 2 dreadnoughts and 15 cruiser-class vessels, Commander Vera added. A defensive alliance would provide unparalleled protection for human colonies in contested space. Very practical, David agreed, noting how Zara's scarred fingers moved precisely even when cutting food, the habits of someone who'd maintained military discipline despite losing military position. His aide materialized beside his chair with the subtle persistence of someone delivering unwelcome information. Ambassador, I've run preliminary analysis on potential partnership outcomes. Lady Thessa's selection would result in immediate economic benefits worth approximately 40 billion credits. Commander Vera's alliance could prevent an estimated 96,000 casualties in future conflicts. And Zara's selection would result in diplomatic complications. Her family was stripped of political standing after Kethra. Her military record shows tactical brilliance but strategic unreliability. The social stigma alone would compromise your effectiveness in future negotiations. David glanced down the table where Zara sat in relative isolation, her posture straight despite obvious discomfort. Define strategic unreliability. She consistently prioritizes ethical considerations over tactical advantage. Military tribunals classify this as emotional compromise that renders her unsuitable for command decisions. In other words, she has principles. In other words, she makes choices based on personal values rather than optimal outcomes. David considered this while Lady Thessa launched into detailed explanations of freight tariff structures. The woman beside him represented everything his diplomatic training said he should want: political connections, economic advantages, strategic benefits that could serve humanity for generations. So why did he keep looking toward the woman at the end of the table who offered nothing but complicated associations and social liability? After dinner, David escaped to the palace's observation deck where massive windows provided a view of the Valerian capital stretching toward 3 moons. The city sparkled with bioluminescent architecture that shifted colors according to traffic patterns and energy consumption, beautiful and efficient, like everything else in Valerian society. Magnificent, isn't it? Zara's voice came from the shadows near the far window. I used to watch the city patterns when I was stationed here before Kethra. Each color represents different civic functions optimized for maximum efficiency. You sound like you miss it. I missed the certainty of belonging somewhere. She stepped into the light, her scars creating intricate shadows across her face. I miss knowing my place in the social structure, even if that place was earned through violence. David joined her at the window, noting how she automatically positioned herself to keep her scarred profile in shadow. A habit born from years of negative reactions. Do you ever think about leaving? Finding somewhere else where your service record would be valued instead of stigmatized? Where would someone like me go? My skills are military strategy and cross-cultural analysis. Both require official positions that my current status makes impossible. What about Earth? The suggestion seemed to genuinely surprise her. Your planet would have no use for a disgraced Valerian officer. We might have use for someone who understands both military strategy and the cost of ethical decision-making. Zara turned to study his expression, apparently searching for signs that he was mocking her. You cannot be serious. I'm always serious about good people being wasted by bureaucratic stupidity. David. Her use of his first name carried weight, as if she'd been practicing it. Your selection tomorrow will determine humanity's relationship with the Valerian Empire for generations. Choosing me would gain you nothing and cost you everything. It would gain me a partner I actually respect. Respect does not negotiate trade agreements or coordinate military defense. No, but it creates the foundation for everything else that matters. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city's light patterns shift through their programmed cycles. David found himself studying Zara's reflection in the window, how her scarred features created an interesting asymmetry that was somehow more compelling than perfect symmetry would have been. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said finally. "Yes. Do you actually want to be chosen tomorrow, or are you hoping I'll select someone else to avoid the political complications?" Zara was quiet for so long that David wondered if he'd overstepped some cultural boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I want to be chosen more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. And that wanting terrifies me because it represents everything I was taught to consider weakness. Wanting connection isn't weakness. It is if that want compromises rational decision-making. What if rational decision-making isn't the only thing that matters? Then everything I was taught about proper behavior and social organization was incorrect." David looked at her reflection again, noting the way her shoulders had tensed as if preparing for disappointment. Maybe everything you were taught was incomplete rather than incorrect. Meaning maybe there's room for both rational analysis and emotional connection. Maybe the best decisions combine both instead of choosing one over the other. Zara met his eyes in the window's reflection. "Is that what you plan to do tomorrow? Combine rational analysis with emotional connection?" "I plan to choose the person I want to work with for the next several years, regardless of what my briefing documents say about optimal political outcomes. And if that choice proves diplomatically disastrous, then I'll deal with the consequences and know I chose with integrity instead of expedience." Zara's reflection smiled, small and uncertain, but genuine. "Your species has very interesting priorities, Ambassador David." "Just David. And yeah, we're weird that way. I find myself appreciating weird priorities." "Good," David said, "because tomorrow you might find yourself partnered with someone who values character over political connections. That would be..." She paused, seeming to search for adequate words. "That would be extraordinary." As they headed back toward their respective quarters, David realized he'd already made his decision. The political ramifications would be significant, the diplomatic complications numerous, and his career prospects uncertain. But some choices, he was learning, mattered more than career prospects. The night before the selection ceremony, David's quarters filled with concerned advisors, updated briefing documents, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince him that choosing Zara would constitute diplomatic malpractice. His aide had prepared a presentation with holographic charts showing potential economic losses, while Dr. Martinez outlined cultural complications, and his security chief detailed potential military disadvantages. "Ambassador," his aide said with the earnest tone of someone preventing a disaster, "final analysis shows Lady Thessa's selection would increase human standing in galactic politics by an estimated 47%. Commander Vera's choice would provide military protection valued at over 200 billion credits. Zara's selection would result in immediate political isolation and long-term strategic disadvantage." "Noted," David replied, reviewing his personal observations from 3 days of interactions rather than political calculations. "Sir, I don't think you understand the magnitude of this decision. Your choice tomorrow doesn't just affect diplomatic relations, it sets precedent for how humanity approaches galactic politics for generations." "I understand perfectly." David set down the briefing materials and faced his concerned team. "I also understand that sometimes the most important qualities can't be measured in trade agreements or military alliances." Dr. Martinez leaned forward with academic intensity. "David, I've studied Valerian culture for 15 years. Choosing Zara would violate every principle of their social hierarchy. You'd be selecting someone they consider fundamentally flawed. Or I'd be selecting someone who represents everything their culture has forgotten about honor and integrity." "That's a very romantic interpretation," his security chief interjected, but romance doesn't protect human colonies from hostile alien forces. No, but having allies you can trust absolutely does. His aide activated another holographic display showing comparative advantages. Sir, look at this objectively. Lady Thessa, trade routes, political connections, social standing. Commander Vera, military alliance, strategic position, defensive capabilities. Zara, social liability, political complications, zero practical advantages. David studied the charts, noting how efficiently they reduced complex human beings to lists of assets and liabilities. What about personal character? Ethical integrity? The ability to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than advantage? Those qualities don't appear in diplomatic assessment protocols because they're considered subjective measurements. Maybe diplomatic assessment protocols are missing something important. The room fell silent except for the hum of environmental systems and the distant sounds of Valerian night traffic. David's team exchanged glances that suggested they were wondering if atmospheric differences had affected his judgment. Ambassador, Dr. Martinez said gently, I appreciate your humanitarian perspective, but galactic politics operates on power dynamics, not personal feelings. Choosing based on emotional connection rather than strategic advantage could destabilize humanity's position for decades. What if emotional connection creates stronger strategic advantages than political calculation? That's not how interstellar diplomacy works. Maybe it's how interstellar diplomacy should work. His aide activated one final display, a comprehensive analysis of potential outcomes based on each selection. The projections were stark. Choosing Lady Thessa or Commander Vera led to measurable benefits across multiple categories, while choosing Zara led to a statistical analysis labeled outcome uncertain due to unprecedented variables. Unprecedented variables, David repeated. You mean like trust, mutual respect, and genuine partnership? We mean like social complications that could undermine your effectiveness in future negotiations, his security chief replied. David dismissed the holographic displays and looked out his quarters window toward the palace gardens where he'd spent hours talking with Zara about everything except political advantages. Let me ask you something. In all your analysis of potential partnerships, did anyone consider which candidate I could actually work with effectively for years? Personal compatibility is assumed to develop over time based on mutual professional interests, his aide explained. What if it doesn't? What if spending years working closely with someone whose values fundamentally conflict with your own creates more problems than short-term political gains solve? Sir, diplomatic partnerships aren't about personal preferences. They're about representing humanity's best interests, David interrupted. And humanity's best interests include maintaining our ethical standards while engaging with galactic civilization. Choosing someone I can't respect undermines both objectives. His team exchanged more concerned glances. Dr. Martinez tried a different approach. David, I understand your attraction to Zara's character, but consider the message her selection would send. You'd be choosing the one candidate every Valerian expert told you to avoid. That suggests either ignorance of their culture or deliberate disrespect for their social norms. Or it suggests that human values differ from current Valerian values in ways that could benefit both our species. That's an enormous risk based on personal intuition rather than established diplomatic protocol. David looked around the room at people whose careers depended on safe, predictable choices that could be justified through established procedures. Sometimes the biggest risks create the most important opportunities. And sometimes they create diplomatic disasters that take decades to repair. A soft chime indicated someone requesting entry to his quarters. David authorized access, and Zara stepped inside, clearly surprised to find his quarters filled with advisors and holographic displays. Ambassador, I apologize for the interruption. I was not aware you were conducting official business. We were just finishing, David said, ignoring his team's expressions of alarm. What can I do for you? Zara glanced at the assembled advisors, then back to David. I wish to speak with you before tomorrow's ceremony, but this is not an appropriate time. Actually, it's perfect timing. David gestured toward an empty chair. Please, sit. I think my team should hear what you have to say. David, his aide warned, this is highly irregular protocol. The best things usually are. Zara settled carefully in the offered chair, her posture reflecting military training despite obvious discomfort with the situation. I came to formally request that you not select me tomorrow. The room went completely silent. David's aide looked smugly vindicated while Dr. Martinez appeared genuinely confused. Why? David asked. Because choosing me would damage everything you came here to accomplish. Your team has spent months preparing for this opportunity, and my selection would waste their efforts. Your people deserve a diplomatic partner who enhances humanity's position, not one who complicates it. His security chief leaned forward with interest. So you acknowledge that your selection would create political complications? I acknowledge that my personal desires should not supersede the welfare of two species. Zara met David's eyes directly. I want to be chosen more than I can adequately express, but wanting something does not make it wise or beneficial. What if I told you that your character matters more to me than political complications? David asked. I would say that character without practical advantages is insufficient foundation for interstellar diplomacy. And what if I told you that practical advantages without character is equally insufficient? Zara considered this while David's team watched their carefully planned selection process evolve into philosophical discussion. Then I would say that optimal outcomes require both character and practical advantages, and perhaps you should choose someone who possesses both qualities. Name someone who possesses both. Lady Thessa demonstrates personal integrity within the context of political acumen. Commander Vera combines ethical leadership with military expertise. David's aide looked triumphant, but David wasn't finished. Do either of them understand the cost of choosing principle over advantage? That is not information I possess. Would either of them sacrifice personal advancement to protect civilian lives? Zara's expression grew thoughtful. I cannot speak to their ethical frameworks under extreme pressure. But I can speak to yours, because I've seen the evidence carved into your skin. The room's atmosphere shifted as David's meaning became clear. His team began to understand that his interest in Zara wasn't romantic attraction or humanitarian sentiment, it was recognition of proven character under impossible circumstances. David, Zara said quietly, my scars represent military failure by Valerian standards. Your scars represent exactly the kind of character I want in a partner by human standards. She stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression as she began to understand that his choice might be based on strength rather than sympathy. I see, she said finally. And tomorrow, you will choose based on human standards rather than Valerian expectations? Tomorrow, I'll choose based on who I trust to help humanity navigate galactic politics without losing our humanity in the process. Zara stood carefully, her military bearing more evident than usual. Then I will accept whatever choice you make and serve humanity's interests to the best of my ability. After she left, David's team sat in stunned silence until his aide finally spoke. Sir, if you're determined to choose her despite all political calculation, at least we understand your reasoning now. Which is? You're not choosing based on attraction or sympathy. You're choosing based on proven performance under pressure. Exactly. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. It's still enormously risky, but at least it's calculated risk rather than emotional impulse. Sometimes the biggest risks create the most important opportunities, David repeated. And sometimes the most important qualities can't be measured in trade agreements. His security chief was quiet for a moment, then admitted, character has strategic value that's difficult to quantify but impossible to fake. Are you all finally understanding why I'm making this choice? His aide sighed with resignation mixed with admiration. We understand, sir. We just hope you're right about the outcome. So do I, David admitted. But I'd rather be wrong about political calculations than wrong about character assessment. As his team filed out to prepare for tomorrow's ceremony, David realized he wasn't just choosing a diplomatic partner, he was choosing what kind of diplomat he wanted to be, and what kind of values he wanted to represent among the stars. Some choices, he was learning, defined you more than they served you. The Crystal Hall had been transformed overnight into something between a cathedral and a courtroom, with representatives from dozens of species arranged in precise diplomatic hierarchy while holographic displays tracked every word for historical record. David stood before Queen Valeria's throne, acutely aware that his next words would determine not just his own future, but potentially the trajectory of human-alien relations for generations. Behind him, the 63 candidates waited in formation, their political value quantified in briefing documents his team had memorized but their personal worth measured in ways no database could capture. His aides stood nearby with final statistical analyses, while Dr. Martinez clutched cultural assessment reports, and his security chief maintained diplomatic composure despite obvious concern about impending career suicide. Ambassador Sterling, Queen Valeria announced, her voice carrying the weight of ceremony and political significance, you have observed our finest daughters, evaluated their qualifications, and considered their potential contributions to the alliance between our peoples. The choice you make today will bind our species in partnership and determine the nature of our collaboration across the stars. No pressure whatsoever, David thought, scanning the assembled candidates one final time. Lady Thessa stood with confident poise, her family's shipping empire practically glowing around her like a profitable aura. Commander Vera maintained military bearing that radiated defensive capabilities and strategic advantage. Duchess Mira embodied political connections that could open doors throughout the galaxy. And at the far edge of the formation, Zara stood apart as she had for 3 days. Scarred, isolated, and offering nothing but character that couldn't be measured in credit transfers or fleet deployments. Take your time, Ambassador, the Queen continued. This decision will shape the future of both our civilizations. David's team exchanged final glances of concern mixed with resignation. They'd done their duty, provided comprehensive analysis, and outlined every possible political consideration. Now they could only watch as their carefully planned diplomatic strategy either succeeded or collapsed based on one human's assessment of character over calculation. Your Majesty, David said, his voice carrying across the vast hall, I have indeed evaluated the qualifications of each candidate. I've considered their political connections, economic advantages, and strategic benefits. I've analyzed how each selection would serve humanity's immediate interests and long-term objectives. Murmurs rippled through the assembled diplomats as they anticipated the logical conclusion of such analysis. Lady Thessa straightened slightly, while Commander Vera's expression suggested confident expectation. Even Duchess Mira seemed to prepare for potential selection. However, David continued, I've also considered what kind of partnership would best represent humanity's values while navigating the complexities of galactic civilization. I've thought about which candidate would help us maintain our ethical standards while pursuing our political objectives. And I've recognized that some qualities matter more than others when building relationships designed to last generations. The hall fell completely silent except for the hum of recording equipment and the distant sounds of the capital city functioning with Valerian efficiency. Therefore, David said, taking a breath that felt like stepping off a diplomatic cliff, I choose the candidate whose character has been proven under the most difficult circumstances. I choose the woman whose scars represent exactly the kind of integrity I want in a partner. He turned toward the candidates and began walking, his footsteps echoing in the crystalline space as he passed Lady Thessa's shocked expression, Commander Vera's military composure, and Duchess Myra's diplomatic confusion. Zara's eyes widened as she realized his direction, her scarred features cycling through disbelief, hope, and terror as the political implications became clear. Other candidates and assembled diplomats began turning to stare, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright scandal as David's choice became obvious. I choose Zara, he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Not despite her scars, but because of what they represent. Not in spite of her military record, but because of the character it demonstrates. He stopped directly in front of her, noting how she seemed frozen between years of expecting rejection and the impossible reality of being chosen. Her violet eyes filled with tears she was desperately trying to contain, while her scarred hands trembled slightly at her sides. "Zara," David said gently, reaching toward the left side of her face where the most prominent scarification created intricate patterns that spoke of courage under impossible circumstances, "you are my choice." The moment his palm touched her scarred cheek, the first gentle, accepting contact she'd received since her disgrace, her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Tears spilled silently down her face as years of rejection, isolation, and self-doubt met the impossible reality of being valued precisely for the things that had made her an outcast. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "You're not alone anymore," he replied, loud enough for the recording devices to capture but soft enough to feel like a promise meant only for her. The hall erupted in controlled diplomatic chaos as representatives attempted to process what they just witnessed. Queen Valeria's expression suggested fascination mixed with political calculation, while David's team looked like people watching their careers reorganize themselves in real time. But David's attention focused entirely on the woman whose silent tears represented something more profound than political alliance or strategic partnership. Her tears spoke of relief so deep it felt like resurrection, of finally being chosen not despite her perceived flaws but because of the strength they represented. "The choice has been made," Queen Valeria announced, her voice cutting through the diplomatic murmurs. "Ambassador Sterling has selected Zara as his diplomatic partner. The alliance between humanity and the Valerian Empire will be represented by this unprecedented pairing." Unprecedented was certainly one way to describe it, David thought, watching as Zara struggled to regain her composure while tears continued streaming down her face. Her scarred fingers found his hand and gripped it like an anchor in a storm of emotions she'd spent 3 years suppressing. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the ceremony's continuing formalities. "Why would you choose social liability over political advantage?" "Because," David replied, his thumb gently brushing away her tears, "you're not a liability. You're exactly the kind of person I want beside me when making decisions that matter. Someone who understands that some things are more important than optimization. But the political complications will be worth it. Because partnerships built on mutual respect last longer than partnerships built on mutual advantage." Zara's smile through her tears transformed her scarred features into something radiant. "Your species truly does have interesting priorities, Ambassador David." "Just David." "And yeah, we do. We value people who choose courage over convenience, integrity over advantage, and character over calculation. Even when those choices result in permanent consequences." David looked at her scars, not as marks of failure or social stigma, but as evidence of someone who'd faced impossible decisions and chosen honor over expedience. Especially then. As the ceremony concluded with formal pronouncements and diplomatic protocols, David realized he'd done more than select a political partner. He'd chosen to represent humanity's values in their purest form, the belief that character mattered more than convenience, that integrity trumped advantage, and that sometimes the most important choice was the one that felt right rather than the one that looked good on paper. 6 months later, when Zara's strategic brilliance had prevented 2 potential conflicts and her cultural insights had opened new diplomatic opportunities no one had anticipated, David's team admitted their initial concerns had been unfounded. Her social liability had become political asset once other species recognized that humanity chose partners based on character rather than convenience. But the real victory wasn't political or strategic, it was personal. It was watching Zara slowly learn to value herself as highly as others valued her, to understand that her scars represented strength rather than failure, and to believe that being chosen could be about worth rather than utility. Some choices, David had learned, changed everything. And the best choices were the ones that changed people for the better, creating partnerships built on mutual respect, shared values, and the radical belief that character mattered more than calculation. In the end, the woman with scars had taught him that the most important diplomatic skill wasn't negotiation or analysis, it was the ability to recognize worth that others had overlooked, and the courage to choose based on what